In today's culture, we often hear messages about masculinity being toxic or positive, or even as oppressive, limiting men in all of these ways, but in other ways, being the very force that liberates them. To be able to understand and make our way through these complex conversations around masculinity, we need to understand how it actually develops in our own lifespan. If we want to figure out whether it's toxic or positive, we actually need to understand how we come to be masculine. In this essay, I'm going to use the movie Boyhood from 2014, which chronicles the life of Mason as an example for how masculinity develops. I then offer a very powerful framework that I call MetaMasculine, which will help you understand your own life narrative in regards to masculinity. If you haven't watched the movie already, I just want to say you can still benefit greatly from this video, but I do recommend going to watch the movie afterward because it's honestly just a great movie. But with all of that out of the way, two important features of masculinity that I think will help guide us are agency and sexuality, and how they often become incredibly tangled up as we develop through childhood. In fact, one of the key stereotypes that separate the genders is agency versus communion. Men, being agentic, are seen as being assertive, independent, and rational, whereas women, being communal, are seen as considerate, relational, and emotional. There's even neuroscientific evidence to suggest that these are not just roles given to us by some patriarchal society, but are instead a part of our nature as male and female animals. However, like I said, we also do need to understand the kind of cultural or environmental component that happens as we grow, as we become, like I said, masculine. And so, like each of us, Mason is taught from a very early age to abide by these stereotypes. One of the first scenes that illustrate this takes place at a bowling alley with his dad and sister, Sam. Sam is celebrated by her father for her skills, whereas Mason is lectured. An obvious explanation for why this happens is just that she's better than him at bowling, and her victory won her celebration. However, I think if we can look a little deeper, it serves as a good example for what I'm actually talking about here. She's congratulated, she's supported, and she's given care and consideration. Her father is treating her well and with relational warmth. When Mason asks for bumpers to help him bowl, his father teaches him that bumpers are for kids. Even at the age of 6, he's not allowed to be a kid. He has to take ownership of his ability to do better through his own actions. Again, we can chalk this all up to Sam doing well and Mason not, but this serves as a good visual example of how a difference in how their father relates to them can lead to two very different strategies in how they approach life. In the context of an entire childhood of such messages, it makes sense that the stereotype of agency would develop for Mason. And what do we see once his dad's back is turned? Sam supports Mason relationally. As a girl, she is considerate, kind, and compassionate, thus reinforcing that this is how she should behave as a girl. The difference was created by the father, but then maintained by the children themselves. While Mason's dad may teach him the difference between agency and communion, it's his stepdad, Bill, who really drills that message in. When Mason is playing golf with his stepbrother, Randy, and his stepdad, he receives another very powerful message. By definition, agency is about separating oneself from others, which means it often requires competition with others. Mason's biological father didn't have him compete with his sister. He was competing with his own agency, or lack thereof. Mason's stepdad blatantly puts him in competition with his stepbrother, putting Randy down and explicitly telling him to look at how Mason is doing better. Think about how this affects the stepbrothers' relationship. Mason and Randy likely consider themselves brothers and friends. They spend most of their time being together, playing together, learning together, and growing up together. Now, one of the most important role models in their lives is forcing them into a new role where they have to compare themselves relative to one another, and whoever comes out the victor will get more support from their father. When they play, they are going to be figuring out who does things better. What was once just a game to have fun now becomes another avenue to see who is more deserving of this man's love. This doesn't merely paint their relationship with the color of competition. It also feeds into their agency itself. Like I said, agency is separating oneself from others. And now we know that we do this by competing with them and being better than them. Or else, our Father won't love us. To top all of this off, we then see the stepdad fail. A string of curses is ended with a violent attack on the ground, a demand for his children to get his things, and a drive to the liquor store. Unpacking the sequence of events, the boys learn that upon failure, a man should react with aggression. They've already learned that only doing well is acceptable, but now they've learned how to deal with their own inability to do well. Get angry and take it out on something. Remember, being a man is being an agent. And when they are commanded to get his things, they are given a message about how agency is exercised. I am a man, I am an agent, and I exert my power over those who are beneath me. You are submissive to me, so do as I say. We can see how, through agency and how we are taught to express it, masculinity becomes tied with competition with others, power over others, aggression, and an inability to accept personal failures. And finally, we end the day with alcohol. To be clear, it isn't necessarily the case that the children will learn to deal with their day, their problems, and their lives with alcohol. The fact that the stepfather is an alcoholic and is later shown to be abusive may actually be a reason for why they learn to be careful with alcohol. However, what children learn from an addict is that they deal with their problems not by dealing with them, but by escaping from them. The stepdad is also a man. By his every action, he is teaching them how to be men. The girls are going to learn how to deal with their problems from an addict, but the boys are also learning that masculinity itself is intimately woven with the very characteristics that are associated with being an addict. I'm going to talk a little more about how this ties with addiction later, but the final stepdad lesson that I want to talk about is Mason's haircut. This is such an important memory for Mason because it solidifies everything we've been discussing so far. Mason has long hair, and his stepdad forces him to buzz all of it off. During the haircut itself, the stepdad acts with his trademark lack of empathy and makes fun of Mason, who is very clearly upset. Again, this reinforces masculinity as agency. Agency as power, as treating the submissive in a certain way. It's not just that he's taught to be powerful as a man, but that being powerful as a man means being an asshole. Being powerful means disregarding the emotions of others when you hurt them. What's more, being a man certainly means not being a woman, and that's precisely why he's getting his haircut. The stepdad tells him, "You're going to look like a man instead of a little girl." With that simple phrase, he's given a vision of what a man is, which specifically includes not being a woman, and as such, women are seen as less than men. Now, the reason that women are seen as less than men is because Mason is given a vision of the ideal man, something he should aspire to, and is then told that everything that is woman is something that doesn't fit that ideal. Mason may begin to interpret anything that is associated with femininity as being worse than the ideal and thus, obviously, inferior. When he sees this behavior in women or men, he will view that behavior as inferior in some way. Even if he doesn't agree that femininity is inferior, the fact that this association has been made means that it may become automatic. He will have to be conscious of the ways it might infect how he defines certain behaviors if those behaviors have been associated with femininity. Again, he doesn't even need to make the association clear by thinking, oh, that behavior doesn't fit the ideal, therefore it's not masculine, therefore it's feminine, therefore women are inferior. He may simply see a woman perform that behavior and think that specific woman is less than him, without making all of those leaps. If women have been taught to perform that specific behavior more often than men, then he'll simply be more likely to believe that certain women are inferior more often. The fact that this is all being defined by emotional pain makes it all the more powerful, makes it all the more formative for him. So to give a specific example, think about what he's learned from his stepdad. Men are agentic, powerful, and dominate others. When they make someone submit to them, and that makes that person angry or upset, Their emotions are meant to be laughed at without empathy. What does all of that mean? If women are empathetic, emotionally vulnerable, and willing to listen, then they'll be assumed to be weak because each of those things violates the definition of power and dominance that he's been given. If a woman displays any of these behaviors, which again, she'll be more likely to than men because of the ways we've been taught, he is far more likely to just roll his eyes or ignore her because these strategies are ineffective strategies. Now, what's very interesting about the haircutting experience is that one person completely changes his perspective. A girl approves of his haircut. Here, everything we've discussed so far is recontextualized by how it becomes tied to approval from women. However, the lessons of manhood were shaped by the pain of that haircut, they are now also tied to how good it feels to have a cute girl in your class tell you that you look cool. Having short hair is an expression of masculinity as agency, power, and domination, and a girl has now approved of that masculinity. Here we finally come to see how masculinity defines and is defined by sexuality. Up to this point in the movie, we have been given hints of how Mason is developing sexually. From lingerie magazines to suggestions of explicit material on a computer screen, what's clear is that this is something to be hidden. When his sisters enter the room, the laptop is quickly shut. Why exactly do they do that? Well, from early on, we learn that sex is something taboo. Whether it's hiding our body parts or not being allowed to talk about it, or knowing adults are trying to keep it a secret, the thread that connects all of these things is that there is something about sex that is inappropriate and that's not acceptable. It is simply something shameful. So, we have something that is shameful, but also something that becomes a direct means through which we exercise our masculinity. At one point, Mason is in the bathroom and two boys start bullying him, pushing him around and calling him gay. Notice how his agency is being challenged, once again calling forth its association with competition, power, and submission. Notice also how it is all now being associated with his sexuality, once again calling forth a vision of the ideal man. The ideal man is agentic, powerful, and competitive, and exerts his power in the hierarchy through his sexual prowess with women. His masculinity is implicitly tied to women because his masculinity is defined by how he is attracted to women. It's not stated outright. Again, it's implicit or connected indirectly. This implicit lesson, though, is that if he's not attracted to women, he is immediately placed at the bottom of the hierarchy. Again, this connects his sexuality and how it's expressed with shame, with not being enough, and with needing to climb a hierarchy in order to become enough. We see the same weaponization of sexuality when Mason is hanging out with some other boys, some of which are older than him. Because of their age, the older boys are automatically higher up the hierarchy, and so the younger boys are naturally going to look up to them. Throughout this scene, everything we've talked about already is reinforced very, very strongly. The younger boys are called pussies if they engage in certain behavior, which of course connects these behaviors with femininity, which is again connected with inferiority. Additionally, not only is being gay inferior, but now the sexual conquest of women is explicitly, outrightly tied with masculinity. The boy's position in the hierarchy is defined by how many women they've slept with, but only when the woman hasn't slept with anyone else. One of the boys is belittled for getting sloppy seconds. In other words, she'll increase your social status, but by less if she's also slept around. Finally, agency over women is also reinforced with the statement, it's not what they want, it's what you want. We are agentic men who gain status through the sexual conquest of chaste women who must submit to us. And if we don't operate effectively enough, we are shameful at the bottom of the hierarchy. All of this takes place within a backdrop of violence. They bond as they break things, connecting masculine camaraderie with aggression, power, and sexual competition. These demands for sexual competition are further reinforced by his first girlfriend, Sheena. While they're still in high school, she leaves Mason for a guy from college. She forced him into competition with an older, better male, and he lost. Mason's biological father reinforces this message by telling him that women are never satisfied. They're always looking to trade up. However, No one is responsible for you but you. A man's agency is tied back into this competition, and of course, once you exercise your agency, you will be surprised by how many women will line up. We have now finished the loop that started back at the little girl who approved of Mason's haircut. Your agency and power as a man are defined by how well you compete with other men for the attention and approval of women you conquer and who must submit to your agency and power. Unless, of course, you fail, in which case you must deal with the shame of being inadequate as a man. Within this framework, one finds little room for genuine fulfillment and love. And that's the issue. Within this framework, we seem trapped within sexual competition, where we're constantly fighting with other men, preventing us from truly connecting with them, and constantly looking for approval from women to prove just how masculine we really are, when all we really want is to live a good life with someone who will love us as much as we love them. Does it make anyone wonder why so many men seem to be checking out of sex, romance, and life altogether? Whether it's through the use of adult videos and escorts, or through celibacy and asceticism, this lack of healthy masculine camaraderie and authentic fulfilling love simply leads many into the pathologies of sexual addiction or sexual anorexia. With our sexuality tied so tightly with shame, we either try desperately to numb ourselves to that shame with addiction, or desperately try to escape from that shame by cutting our sexuality away completely. This trap raises the important question about whether or not this definition of masculinity is really about agency and all of its many expressions. Notice how this definition of masculinity creates a hierarchy in which men must compete with each other in order to secure their agency. In other words, you have to submit yourself to the rules of someone else's game in order to be successful enough to have your own agency and power. But how can we have agency when we are submitting ourselves to someone else's definition of success? This is the paradox of our masculinity. We play at agency, at power, and at dominance, all the while ignoring someone else has defined the terms of that agency, power, and dominance. Then, when we find ourselves overcome by the stress of constant competition and beat ourselves up when we fail, we act surprised when we run to the liquor store or type in an adult website we promised ourselves we wouldn't go to anymore. We've been locked in a game given to us by our forebears and been taught that the only means of escape is addiction or asceticism. If you want to learn how to free yourself from this game, then check out my free assignments in the top comment below. I don't think I need to tell you that addiction is not a real means of escape, and asceticism often simply becomes a never-ending self-imprisonment fueled by self-hatred. Instead, we must learn how to deconstruct and then reconstruct our masculinity and all the elements we've already discussed. To accomplish this goal, I want to introduce a very powerful framework I have found for understanding masculinity, but also just life and reality in general. When applied to masculinity, I call this framework the MetaMasculine. To begin understanding what that actually means, we have to first look at the word meta, which, according to Jonathan Rowson, has at least 3 meanings. The first meaning is with, which means that no matter what we do as men, we will always be with our masculinity. Masculinity is the way in which men see themselves, engage in the world, and are seen in turn by that world. Even if I were to wear a dress and makeup, there are people who would literally take that as a challenge to continue to treat me as a man. So, as someone who is a man, I will always be with masculinity, whether I want to be or not. There are games being played, and so we must play them. Change them for the better, obviously, but play them nonetheless. As such, I must take ownership over my masculinity so that I can improve it for myself and others. Secondly, though, we have meta as beyond, which means going beyond or above masculinity. To be able to change our masculinity for the better, we have to be able to look at the elements we want to change and how they actually relate with one another, which of course requires us to be able to see it from the outside. This is what I've done throughout this essay. I've taken a bird's eye view of how masculinity developed in Mason's life. We've learned that masculinity is about how we as men exercise our agency through the employment of power over ourselves and others, through competition with others to prove that we are worthy of love and positive attention, and through sexual conquest of women who are seen as inferior because they aren't masculine. As such, this requires that we reject anything feminine within ourselves and use shame anytime we are unable to effectively play the games of masculinity. From the vantage point that we gained through the use of meta, we can begin challenging these narratives and changing them towards something better for ourselves and for others. Finally, though, we have meta as after, which situates masculinity in a historical context, both personally and culturally. Again, I've done that throughout this entire essay by going over how masculinity developed for Mason personally. Your story may be different, although the general themes may be the same because of how masculinity has been defined for us culturally. This is where we get into how masculinity has been defined by the wider culture around us and how it has changed over the years based on the environmental conditions placed upon it. We have to understand that modern masculinity isn't the same as what was masculine 1,000 years ago or even 100 years ago. The challenges that today's men face are different, and so the ideal vision of masculinity is going to be different. As men, we need to be able to define for ourselves what vision of masculinity will actually be able to handle the complexity of our age so that we can create positive change for, you guessed it, ourselves and others. With this tripartite understanding, we are afforded the best grasp of masculinity that we can currently muster. The MetaMasculine, then, is not so much a definition of masculinity as such, but is a definition of a certain kind of relationship with masculinity. In that spirit, then, we must be able to take what's called a transperspectival view of masculinity. This has nothing to do with transgender, but is simply understanding that masculinity can be seen from various perspectives, whether traditional, red pill, feminist, biological, developmental, etc. This is important because we run into problems when we become too attached to any one lens and assume that all the answers can be found when we take that single lens as gospel and reject every other lens. For example, viewing masculinity through a feminist lens can help us see the ways in which patriarchal power has oppressed not just women, but also men. However, viewing it exclusively through the feminist lens would have us see masculinity as an oppressive force that must be deconstructed so we can come to that utopian female future we've all heard so much about. The same can also be said of red pill, that would have us liberated in many ways, and yet in many ways simply reinforces the games of false agency, competition with other men, and the conquest of women. It is through challenging our own perspective and properly integrating the perspectives of others that we are able to come to that transperspectival understanding. We're able to go beyond our current understanding of masculinity in order to create something that can come after everything that masculinity has been up to this point, all the while being with our masculinity as men. Finally free, we are no longer forced to look for escape in addiction or asceticism, but can face ourselves and our lives with the strength, wisdom, and compassion of the MetaMasculine. Either way, that is enough for today. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Please hit the like button and subscribe for more essays and conversations that go very deeply into masculinity, psychological development, and the cultivation of a meaningful personal mythology. Thanks again, and all the best to you on whatever journey you find yourself on.